Welcome to our mutual interest. I'm your host, Mina Fombo, but it's your stories that make this show more than a Heising podcast. Spades in the grind, let's go. On today's episode, I'm joined by Euella Jackson, an award-winning presenter, filmmaker, and creative producer. Euella is someone who proudly calls herself a disruptive storyteller who gives a and trust me, she really does. She works across multiple creative disciplines, community building spaces, and activist movements to energize audiences who might not give a yet. In this episode, we get into climate justice through her beautiful short film Capsule. We talk storytelling with communities, explore play and joy as tools for system change, and dive into youth leadership, imagination, governance, and making space for new voices. Euella Jackson, welcome to our mutual interest. I'm so happy to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to get straight into it because we've got so much to talk about. But first of all, after, you're going through your bio, there's so much going on there. We've known each other a little while, so I know a bit more about you. But I'd love to kind of know, how did you become this disruptive storyteller? Is that how you introduce yourself? Tell us a bit more about how you became this storyteller and the work that you're doing now.
For me, storytelling, I always say, is a thread that links all of my work. And I guess it took me a while to realize that was the main thing. I definitely had a career that I went to uni, I did sociology. So there were some really key issues for me, that was grounded in the ways in which I was engaging with the world. I kind of came to sociology mainly through my dad, who didn't do a degree or anything in sociology, but the stories that he would tell me when I was little were very much sociological questions that I was able to only when I got to uni, I was like, oh my God, my dad actually knows some stuff. And he was trying to help me understand, come with a critical lens of how I'm moving through the world. Being able to be a storyteller, and particularly a disruptive and creative storyteller, means that I like to take these big issues, these things that maybe are a bit taboo or things that we haven't quite grappled with as a society, and to be able to hold it in ways that feel maybe a bit more either palatable, a bit more, manageable, or something that people can just get their teeth into. So for me, being the disruptive aspect, I think definitely has come with age and with confidence and growing into my own Black womanhood of what does it mean to kind of move in a space and disrupt it either by your very being or by the things that you're proposing or the ways that you're bringing people together. So the disruptive aspect is definitely something that I want to continue to aspire to, regardless of age or what I'm doing with myself.
The thing that stood out for me there, and forgive me, but it did, is listen to your parents. I mean, how disruptive is it to your younger self to be oh, maybe I should listen to, what my parents or my guardians are saying? Because it sounds like, your dad was onto something, but, and he kind of let you discover what he was onto as you went through life. Tell us about that.
Me and my dad have always had a very, I would say, peer relationship. I'm sure, obviously, there have been times when my dad is my dad and I'm his daughter, but we have very much been really, really good friends. And my parents were separated when I was quite young, but when I would come home from school, I would always, the first thing I did was call my dad, and we'd be on the phone for hours. He would help me with my homework over the phone, particularly maths and science were his bag. My mum was definitely more of an English, humanities babe. But I think it's interesting, and even the ways in which our relationship is, I think is quite disruptive. Even my familial structure of how I grew up, of my parents were separated, but my mom and her sister, they raised their kids together. So me and my cousin basically grew up as brother and sister, and having half siblings and stuff like that. Where I was growing up at the time was quite a predominantly white, heteronormative area. Even the solidarity that was formed between my mom and my auntie, who were two women raising their children. Then we had a lesbian couple up the road who really identified with that. So it was I think in terms of the disruption is I feel like I have been able to see the multiplicity of not just the ways that families are set up, but also like the different relationships. Like me and my dad, I think definitely I'm the parent now and he's definitely living his best life on his gap year kind of energy. And I'm the one that's like worried so I think that is where more of the disruptive in our relationship. But yeah, I guess to some extent, listen to your parents. I think my mum was the one who's like, don't put yourself on the internet because you'll never get a job. And that is the thing I didn't listen to. And I'm glad I did.
Back when the internet was this scary place and people didn't know what it was going to become. Thinking about my experience, I've talked on the podcast before about being fostered. So I've got like a white English family, then I've got my black Nigerian family, and I was kind of back and forth between the two. And for me, like, it was very normal to not have a conventional family. And that's saying, like, why blend in when you were born to stand out? I think being like, the only black child in my school, like I was never the norm, if that makes sense. But I was the only girl that played football with the boys. And so I think having those foundations just as part of your normalized experience of life, as you get older and you kind of find your profession or you go into things, it's almost like, I'm just going to do this thing that no one else is doing because I've always been the only one, or I've always been doing the thing that's different. And there's actually sometimes a comfort in just doing the thing that's different because you have that confidence to know that, well, I don't really like what's happening over there. I'm not really into that thing. So I'm just not going to do it. And that's okay.
I think a lot of people, particularly those who are marginalized or have intersecting identities, like often our experiences aren't part of the norm. And we either have a really strong pressure to like assimilate and just like, as you say, like blend in, or stand out and be like, that doesn't fit at all. And I think I really like even thinking about growing up and like beauty standards as well, of like growing up being a young girl, but just knowing that I didn't fit the beauty standards at all. So that in some ways there was a freedom for me because it was like, well, people don't find me attractive, or I'm not, you know what I mean? Or
I'm black. There we go.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah. Let's just carry on.
Let me just do my thing. And, whereas I really felt like my white peers at the time had almost so much pressure on them because they either kind of did fit the beauty standard or didn't quite, or was closer to it. So I felt like that, in terms of that kind of like almost teenage angst of being part of that. It also relates to, this is such a tangent, but I did like a year abroad in America. One of the modules that I did was history of sexuality, because that is or has definitely been my bag. The professor said something that I found really interesting around basically talking about blackness, particularly in American context, but also around, that I guess that similar thing about the idea of like black people, particularly in America, in the South, were obviously oppressed, subjugated, enslaved. And particularly when you're moving out of that, you have on one end, you have like the kind of respectability politics of like trying to show that, oh, we're not as, lazy or dirty or whatever as the white people are saying that we are. But on another side, they were like, because there was maybe they weren't even considered or seen to be anything, there was a freedom for them to really like, in terms of their music and in terms of their dress sense and the flavor and the sauce. And it was just like a really interesting, I never kind of heard that perspective or that interpretation of like, sometimes when you're outside of the structures, there's space and there's freedom to do, like, to be creative, I guess. But when you're within that, either the kind of stiff upper lip or, refined society, there's a lot of suppression that comes out in maybe insidious ways. So it was just like a really interesting contrast.
I hear what you're saying. I think for me, like I talk a lot about sport, and like when it was the Women's Rugby World Cup, last summer in the UK, absolutely amazing. Rugby's one of my jams, my sport. But what was really great about it is like through all the interviews, the players and all the rugby enthusiasts were saying, we've got the capacity, the ability and the opportunity to make women's rugby whatever we want, because it hasn't been done like this before. And we don't have to do what the men's game has done. We don't have to act like them. We don't have to, engage like them. So with the women's game, it's a lot about engaging with your fans. After the matches, the Premiership players, the international players are walking around the stadium, talking to the fans, engaging with the fans. Women's sport, wider than rugby, has been engaging on TikToks and having fun with it. Whereas in sort of the male space, it's always been seen as this like elite sport, and they don't do that. And all of their marketing is perfectly, orchestrated. And there's a younger generation of guys coming through now that are playing with that and engaging with it. But women's sport, that's how we've had to grow our audiences and get our fans, because we weren't in mainstream spaces. And so I think you're right. There's a freedom that comes with, not being seen in a space for marginalized groups or for, underserved communities, to just be free to make it whatever we want. And I think for me, within the housing sector, what's really exciting being at Merthyr Valley's Homes, particularly, is like when we're looking at the way that we work with our tenants, we're a mutual. So we're governed by obviously tenants and employees, and the way we co-create and co-design spaces, and then bring in the arts and creativity and storytelling into that space. What does that mean for housing, and how can we share practice, which is why I'm so glad that you're here. Let's talk about your work with engaging communities in storytelling. You've got this amazing, beautiful short film called Capsule, which looks at, I guess, climate justice. Tell us a bit more about that film, and then talk us through your creative process when it comes to sort of co-creating and co-designing with communities.
Capsule was a short film that I wrote and directed back in 2024. As you said, it's about exploring climate justice, thinking about just transition, but particularly on that kind of really micro scale. It was part of a brief from Bristol Climate and Nature Partnership, who are doing lots of incredible work around supporting the readiness of climate justice and green transition, I guess.
To keep our audience with us and our listener, you never know. What even is just transition? Tell our listener more about that to bring us on this journey.
So Bristol Climate and Nature Partnership, which is an organisation doing lots of work around climate justice and this idea of like the green or just transition, which in very simple terms is basically thinking about how, as a society, in every aspect of our lives, how do we move towards more, I guess, sustainable, greener, and more socially just practices that benefit both people and planet. And so they've been doing lots of work in the region around that. And I was commissioned to make a film that was, I guess, raising awareness of what this thing, a just transition, is, or what it could be. In terms of the design of Capsule, it was all about engaging with local communities around what their ideas, what their hopes and what their dreams are for a just transition. And I did a games night and I did a supper club in two very different areas in Bristol, invited people free to participate, food, everything paid for. And it was a moment for particularly us to think about the fact that often when we're talking about these ideas of like just transition, net zero, all these crazy big words that don't really mean a lot, what does it mean to communities? What are the things that are good now that's happening that we want to continue and keep with us as we move to this new way of organising, living our lives? I guess, where are the spaces for joy and creativity in that? And so for me, Capsule was about taking something that's quite a big topic and, obviously we're thinking about on a global scale most of the time. How do we take it to something like minuscule, like really, really tiny? And how do we kind of capture it in the story of a small boy and his grandmother and the relationship between them and a conversation that they have about their dreams for the future, essentially. So in terms of that kind of creative process, it was very much a back and forth with the community. Like in my day job, I currently work at Rising Arts Agency. That is a social enterprise supporting young people aged 18 to 30. Our community, particularly young people, are really quite political. They have a lot of ideas about the future. They have a really strong sense of justice. So already there were things that were coming out about how young people are feeling about the future. And there is a lot of hopelessness and helplessness, anger, frustration, all of the feels. But I think it really wanted to center it on joy. And like, where does joy come out in this? So those events were really integral in that. But in terms of really thinking about what are the good things that are happening now? So that was really like the main prompt. I didn't want to get bogged down in language, particularly when you're thinking of things like net zero, carbon sequestration, all these things that it's like, ton. We don't need to know any of that. We just need to know about the ways in which we can do things that help people and planet simultaneously. And I think the people thing was the thing that was really key to me, because I'm like, we've got our scientists, we've got the people who are like conservationists, we've got the, I guess, the ecosystem of people working towards this sciencey side of it. But in terms of like the social justice aspects, like how do we bring social justice back into climate justice, essentially?
I love just to kind of take a small bit of what you said there, but people and planet. We have one planet. And we are one people. There'll be lots of people out there, lots of groups that might say that we're not, but essentially we're one people and we've got one planet. And if we can kind of try and take something, like you said, some of these big terms, some of this academic language, and just bring it back to keeping it simple. And this is what we're fighting for. This is what we're working towards. And this is how we get there. When you talk a lot about sort of play and gamifying, we watch content because we enjoy it. Do you know what I mean? Or we're trying to learn something. When you laugh and you smile, you send endorphins through your body. You physically feel good. And play can kind of help do that. And then finding joy in such big topics, it can sometimes feel the weight of you. Because sometimes you're like, oh, should I be having this plastic straw? I kind of prefer a plastic straw because it's nicer, it doesn't get soggy like a cardboard one, but am I killing the planet? And it can feel so much pressure from a tiny action, but actually like it doesn't need to feel like that, because there's lots of things that we can do within our day-to-day and within our organizations that actually, when you add them up, they do have a sort of positive impact. You mentioned working with young people. So young people kind of having this real sense of sort of social justice and this real sort of passion. And I see that across Wales. I see that with the young people at Merthyr Valley's homes. I see that, in young people that we see in terms of what's happening on social media and in other organizations. You've done a lot of work with supporting, young voices onto boards. I think part of that intergenerational voice to drive change, to drive systems, to influence practice for the future is really kind of key, I guess, in shaping our services. What do you think is useful to share from your world with the housing sector?
I really love governance. I think it scratches, and by governance, it's like leadership, how we bring people together, how a group of people organize. It can be anything from a big institution to like just a small collective of people. And I think there are so many exciting things from the arts and culture sector around bringing people together, holding space, having that care that is great for other industries and sectors to learn from. So whether we're thinking about creative facilitation techniques, like how is a space held? How are people taken care of through that process? How do we acknowledge and embed access and inclusion in them? Like Rising Arts Agency has been doing a lot of work around, as you said, getting young people onto boards. For us, it was really important. And same like with your organisation, you're bringing people into spaces where there are already power dynamics. What is the responsibility there? Often people are either brought in and it's quite tokenistic, if they even get in at all, right? Most spaces, they're not even in the room, but when they get to the space, often it's quite tokenistic. There's either a burden of representation, them feeling that they have to represent the voices of everyone who has their same lived experience. And that can be a lot of pressure, but also in the ways in which power is just distributed in the space. What we've been interested in, I guess initially Rising was really interested in like how can we bring young people into governance, and not just young people, but underrepresented, marginalized identities, particularly young people, into spaces of governance. But then I think what we started to learn was actually it wasn't about the young people. The young people have the ideas, the young people can actually understand a lot of the things that are going on. Is actually about the processes, about when they get there. It's about the culture of the space, and also about some of the mechanisms that hold or share power. For us, thinking about creative facilitation, as we said, about the way that play and joy and creativity, like when people are not in that kind of fight or flight or survival mode, that's when things feel really possible. And that's when the role of the imagination can come in. Like I'm really inspired by Adrienne Marie Brown's pleasure activism and thinking about the role of things like science fiction as a way to kind of bring in new ways of being. You're getting excited.
You're laughing because I'm snapping my fingers because science fiction takes you to a whole nother place, right? You can create, like you said, it can be anything, like with the rugby analogy that we gave earlier, and like with being in a space, you know, or being the first to do something, it can look any which way. And I think science fiction is a really wonderful space to explore, like, what could it be?
We recently at Rising played a game. We were trying to turn it from a Dungeons and Dragons game to explore how we were thinking about our strategy as an organization. But we ended up playing a game. It was led by a member of our community called Carlo. But we ended up playing a game called A Quiet Year, which is like a collaborative map making game where you build a map based on all these different prompts as a collective. And then you think about the inhabitants of that space and what happens to them and etc. But it is, as you say, like an incredible tool. I think there's also something about maybe some of the lessons that can be learned, thinking about expansive definitions. For example, if we're talking about housing, in the arts and culture, a house is not a house, you know, and sometimes there has to be something else.
A house is like a hat, or a house is your jacket.
Exactly. Yeah. Being able to have that experimentation one side, to be able to understand that a building is a house and as a home for people. So really thinking about the responsibility there. But on the other side of like thinking about using a house as an exhibition space or a play space or a communal space or a place for sports and leisure. And I think when you're designing and co-designing spaces, ensuring that the people that you are engaging with and who are working with you are in a space of like abundance when you're having these conversations, because if you're in a place of scarcity or survival, you're not going to be able to dream and you're not going to be able to contribute fully. So like
or frustration, you know, if for example, your needs are not being met as a service user and you're part of a tenant board or part of a tenant insights group or something, you're coming into that space knowing that your roof is still leaking and you're still having to make phone calls. And therefore, when someone's saying, oh, what else could a house be? And Mary says, oh, maybe it's my jacket. You're like, my roof is not fixed. And you're in a different place to contribute when maybe a team member or a colleague is in that space and they're coming in it from a work perspective. And they're like, yeah, I'm here to play. I'm here to explore. I'm here to bring arts to my practice and think about what we can create. But somebody else is coming in and there's a very real need that's not being met. So I think even just like you said, when you're curating that, I'm a facilitator as well. And like when you're curating that environment for people to, particularly when it comes to play and to create and to find joy, especially in subjects where we look about equality and equity, diversity, inclusion, as well as like housing standards and needs, you have to let people come into the space on an equal or on an equitable footing. And in order to do that, other needs have got to have been met first whilst you create the space. Otherwise, you definitely find that people can't play with you because they're just like, what? Or even if just your colleague's just really busy, you've brought them in and it's like, let's dream for 5 minutes to see what can come. And they're like, I've got 10 reports to write. And so that pre-work of setting up the environment we're trying to create. But once it's created, like you said, it's amazing.
In terms of the work, being those kind of like community stewards, and as you've literally just said, you know, how are the needs met and afterwards. And I think it's just about how do you really support people. And if you're in the housing sector, particularly if you're thinking of like Maslow's like hierarchy of needs, like you are working with those kind of fundamental physical needs that are related to many others, you know? As you say, if your roof's leaking, that's going to have a mental impact as well as either a financial impact or whatever, as well as a physical impact. So in terms of being able to support people to dream, you have to also have that infrastructure, I guess. So it's thinking about the infrastructure of dreams.
We played inclusion strategy bingo the other day. And that was my way of kind of just gamifying and just bringing some play into developing our cultural inclusion pillars for the organization. And it was kind of like a bit left field. I was like, is it going to land? And it definitely landed. And it was with like, you know, members of our democratic body, so tenants, colleagues in the space together. But yeah, it was a really great sort of way, like I said, to think about when you say, oh, we're going to do strategy, it's like, oh yeah, strategy. And it's like, actually, let's bring something and physically see people moving. And, you know, we had a bit of a timer going and what I got back, I don't believe I would have got back in just an everyday conversation. And I think it's really important to, really just lean in to that kind of sense of play and gamifying stuff as and when is appropriate. There's always a place for traditional meetings and conversations and conferences. Euella, you do 101 things. What's something that we don't talk about enough when it comes to either creativity, community, or culture that you wish that we would take more seriously?
As I said, I'm really into pleasure activism. And it is the idea that activism can be led by what feels good in our bodies. And often we deny our bodies and what feels good when we're moving through the world. I think there's something about the idea that pleasure and discomfort can coexist. Sometimes I think if you're actually doing the work, particularly if you're someone who's of a position of authority or power, there should be some discomfort for you. Often we kind of do the good job and then we pat ourselves on the back and we're like, yeah, we're doing the work. But actually, then if you're really kind of creating equity in your spaces, if you're really kind of like supporting others to take up their own power, there should be an element of discomfort there for you. There's been this thing that's on social media a lot recently about being in community is inconvenient. And I think definitely for me, like you get into this life or this cycle of living where everything feels really convenient. You can get your Uber Eats, you can do this, you can do that, click of a button. Actually being in community, actually doing the work is about showing up, and it's a practice and it has to be resourced. And, you know, it can't just be on one person to do. And all of these things about cooking a bit extra, having your friend drop by when unexpected, all of that, that is the stuff that we need to be really like, that's the muscle that we need to be really growing, particularly now. And I think, especially as you guys are working in housing, I think that is where the fundamental foundation of where charity and community start. It's maybe that's not the right word. That's the word that's been used online, but it is the thing that you do kind of have to show up.
And I think that goes back to building within our sector, building communities, not houses, you know, building communities, building homes, you know, supporting people to really thrive. So for example, I was just the other day, I was at one of our tenants' houses. We were doing a little film with that tenant. In the middle of the sort of bungalow area, we've got our community space, which is part of our like community living scheme. So it's people over 50s. I was there and I was like, this is amazing. Like I would love to live somewhere like this, where there's like a community space at the end of my road with peers of mine that I can just pop in at any point of the day and they're just going to be there. And you haven't got to rely on like organizing 2 weeks in advance and finding time in someone's calendar and making it work. You can just be like, oh, I feel like some company. I'm just going to pop down the road and hang out with like my neighbors. You know, a lot of the time, those community living schemes are amazing, but a lot of the time those places don't exist in that way. And I think as a society, we need to think about, what does it look like to support people to thrive? What does it look like to be intentional about the spaces that we curate that enable people to connect and form community? And there is an element of convenience in that, but at the same time, I think that would be an element of convenience that I would fight for over Uber Eats.
100%.
So what's something that you've taken a risk on creatively in your practice? You said, it's like feeling uncomfortable and like not having convenience. So tell us somewhere where you've sort of taken a risk, and did it or did it not pay off?
I actually think being a creative has been a bit of a...
How are you paying your bills with that?
Literally. It is, there is a risky element of it. I think I have always been someone who could straddle the two of like the kind of academic side and the more creative side. I've maybe been able to bounce a bit more. But I do think there is a precarity of being a creative, but in many ways it keeps you close to the work and the purpose of the work and why it's important. I don't think that should be the case. I think that, I think you should be able to stay grounded in what the reasons for being part of the work and not having to have these other existential maybe questions about how to make it work or whatever. But I think particularly when I was younger, coming up through YouTube, it was a bit risky in terms of like I was doing a series on sex and relationships as a young Black woman who I already felt quite hypersexualized anyway, but it was something that I was really, really interested in. And I feel like I had to intellectualize my content even more than I would have had to had I either been someone else or at a different stage of my life. That's a moment where I'm really proud, because it was something that, I remember working at Waitrose and my boss being like, I've seen your YouTube channel. Which is like part of me was like, oh, wow, it's finding an audience, but also like, I don't know if you were the audience intended, like it's one of those things. But I think when you're young, you have a really, really strong sense of justice. And you have a really, regardless of, I think you just don't have the baggage of the world on you. And I think as you get older, for different reasons, your activism or your justice can look different or shaped by what's around you. And I am very proud of the fact that as a young person, I really feel like I kind of just did what I wanted and was like, I'm going to F around and find out. And that is something that I'm trying to take with me. And that's why I really enjoy working with young people at the moment, because you keep that energy of just being able to be like, do you know what, let's just risk it for a chocolate biscuit and see what happens.
For me, I love the intergenerational aspect. So for me, like, I'm really enjoying at this point of my life talking to my older aunties about their experiences. Do you know what I mean? Especially as a generation of Nigerians that moved to the UK before the internet, before you knew what it would look like. There's only a very specific demographic that were like that. So I'm enjoying absorbing from them. But I love being around young people because they keep you honest and they do keep you raw. Whether that's like talking to my 12-year-old niece or talking to like young people sort of earlier in their careers. Like you said, there's a real sense of social justice, and sometimes it reminds you to be like, oh yeah, I've still got it in me. Don't lose it. Don't get beaten down by like the world or the system or how hard it can be, or all the strategy that needs to go behind something. I think it helps keep people honest. And I think, again, when we're looking at sort of our sector and looking at housing, I do think there's really something important about bringing young voices on this journey, with us as we continue to build and create, because they are the future. They can help kind of just say the things that we may not say anymore or forget to say, because we're getting so old, we just forget. No offense to older people. That's me speaking specifically about myself, definitely menopausal, nothing to do with being old, just the hormones. Let's bring it to almost a close. But what's giving you energy right now? What's happening for you that's bringing you energy?
Rising's leadership transition is bringing me energy. It's something that we commit to every 5 years, that our directors step away and make space for new voices and new leaders. So we're in the midst of that recruitment at the moment. And it's so exciting to just, like we said about the energy, is not necessarily about age. It's also about people really excited by the work that we're doing and want to continue it. It feels really good. And also just it being a model that we hope we can share with other organizations.
So you hear that, directors out there in the housing sector, you're going to walk away from your roles and another generation is going to come in and you're going to create space for them to keep things fresh, re-energized, and keep things moving.
It's very exciting and exhilarating. I think people will be surprised how much of a joyful process it can be. I'm loving reading and writing at the moment, like getting my head in a book. And I'm also really into like kind of thinking about resource mobilization and so that's like moving wealth and distributing money and wealth in terms like these kind of big structures. So looking at places like the Good Ancestor Movement and Lankelly Chase that are like distributing their whole endowment fund and stuff like that. Like, I'm really interested in those big shifts that are happening. What happens when you bring these kind of like established processes and try and imagine something different? And then you can tell that there was some creative facilitation that must have happened in there. But what happens if we bring a little bit more into it? So that's what kind of is bringing me energy and excitement at the moment.
Fantastic. And last but not least, if you imagine an intergenerational, inclusive community that's built through story, play and imagination, what does that future feel like?
I think it feels like sunshine on your skin. I think it feels like nourishing, abundant, a bit scary. I think there needs to be a little bit of jeopardy in there, because I think this stuff is really important. And I think when you're working with something, it's like if you're holding something really valuable, you worry that it's like seeing my boyfriend pick up a baby. He's so scared he's going to drop it. But I think that's the kind of energy sometimes that we need to be treating communities and the work that we're doing. Like, it is really, really important. It's not just like your bread and butter. This is really important. This is people's lives.
But it feels like sunshine on your skin. I love that. Yeah. Euella, you've been great. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll catch you soon.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Our mutual interest is powered by Merthyr Valleys Homes.